They told him not to do it. Not his political opponents, not the media, not foreign leaders, his own advisors, the people inside the White House, the people who read the same polling data every morning, the people who see the economic projections months before the public ever hears about them. And their message was simple: focus on the economy, not Iran. Because in early 2026, the economy was Donald Trump's strongest political weapon. Inflation was finally starting to cool, consumer confidence was slowly recovering, and Republican strategists believed they had the perfect message heading into the midterm elections. Affordability, lower prices, economic strength. That was the playbook. Just days before everything changed, Trump had delivered a major speech focused almost entirely on the cost of living for American families: gas prices, groceries, housing. The message was clear. America was stabilizing, but behind the scenes, something very different was happening. On February 21st, a report from Reuters quietly revealed what was unfolding inside the administration. According to multiple senior sources, Trump's own advisors were urgently warning him in private escalating tensions with Iran could become a political and economic disaster. One advisor, speaking to Axios, put it bluntly: the boss is getting fed up, and the probability of military action against Iran within weeks was close to 90%. Think about that number for a moment. 90%. That wasn't speculation from analysts on television. That was coming from someone inside the administration, someone who could see the troop movements, someone who understood what was being prepared behind the scenes, because while the public was still hearing diplomatic language, the machinery of war was already beginning to move. Carrier strike groups were repositioned. Strategic bombers were moved closer to the region. Hundreds of combat aircraft were placed on standby. And according to defense sources, the Pentagon had already prepared the full operational package for a potential multi-week air campaign against Iran. Not a symbolic strike, not a limited operation, a sustained military campaign. In fact, officials were privately describing it as the most aggressive American action against Iran since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. That phrase alone should have set off alarm bells. The most aggressive action since 1979? That's not a skirmish. That's not a warning shot. That's a war. And Trump's advisors knew exactly what wars cost. But the deeper problem wasn't just the war itself. It was the timing, because politically, the Republican strategy for 2026 had already been locked in. Win the economic argument. Convince voters that the worst inflation crisis in decades was finally behind them. Convince middle-class families that the economy was stabilizing. And above all else, avoid any major international crisis that could send energy prices exploding again. But then Trump began signaling something very different. During a public appearance, he issued a direct warning to Tehran. Iran better negotiate a fair deal, he said. And if that doesn't happen, bad things will happen. Not diplomatic language, not vague threats. Bad things. Days later, speaking again to reporters, Trump added another line that now sounds almost like a countdown. You'll find out in probably 10 days, he said. Maybe we make a deal. Maybe we take it a step further. 10 days. A deadline. And once that clock started ticking, everyone inside Washington understood something important. If Iran didn't deliver a deal that satisfied Trump within that window, the military option would move from theory to reality. Inside the White House, the debates intensified. Some advisors pushed for more negotiations. Others argued that Iran had already crossed too many red lines. But then something happened that always signals the same thing in Washington. The military started moving. And when that happens, everyone knows the decision has already been made. Because once carrier groups are deployed, once hundreds of aircraft are positioned, once the operational codes are generated, stopping the momentum becomes almost impossible. And within hours, The moment Trump's advisors had been trying to prevent for weeks finally arrived. The strikes began. But here's where the story becomes far more dangerous. Because what terrified Republican strategists wasn't just the war itself, it was the number attached to it, a number that almost nobody in mainstream coverage was talking about. $300 billion. And that might only be the beginning. So let's talk about the number, $300 billion. Because when analysts inside Washington started running the calculations, they realized something alarming. The real cost of this conflict might not be measured only in bombs, missiles, or military deployments. It could be measured in oil prices. And that's where the trap begins. Let's break it down step by step. First, the direct military cost. A multi-week air campaign against Iran is not cheap. Israeli defense economists, analyzing similar scenarios in the past, estimated that a sustained operation against Iranian targets could cost somewhere between $2 and $4 billion. But the American military doesn't operate at Israeli scale. The United States deploys more aircraft, more ships, more logistics, and more personnel. When you factor in fuel, precision munitions, base operations, and the sheer size of the American force package, Pentagon estimates quickly climb. Some analysts now believe the opening phase alone could cost at least $50 billion. And remember, that's just the starting point, because the second cost is far more dangerous: oil. Before the strikes began, Brent crude was already trading around $89 per barrel. Traders had already started pricing in what they call a war premium. Then the bombing started. Within a single trading session, crude prices jumped sharply as markets reacted to the possibility of a wider regional conflict. Energy analysts immediately began looking at one location that controls the fate of the global oil market: the Strait of Hormuz. If you're not familiar with it, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the most important shipping lanes on Earth. Roughly 15% of the world's seaborne oil passes through that narrow stretch of water every single day. And Iran sits right next to it. If tanker traffic slows or stops, the impact on global energy prices can be immediate. Energy consultancy Wood Mackenzie warned that if disruptions in the strait continue, oil prices could easily move above $100 per barrel. And that's where the math becomes brutal, because the United States consumes roughly 20 million barrels of oil every day. Now imagine oil prices rising $40 above their previous baseline. $40 multiplied by 20 million barrels per day, multiplied by 365 days. That single calculation produces a number that should make every policymaker nervous. $292 billion. Not in military spending, not in reconstruction, just the economic impact of higher oil prices. Suddenly, that $50 billion military campaign looks very different. Add the oil shock, and you're already approaching $340 billion. And we still haven't talked about the third piece of the puzzle. The markets. Financial analysts have seen this pattern before. Whenever a major military conflict erupts in the Middle East, investors react fast, and usually not in a good way. Some market strategists warned that large-scale strikes against Iran could send shockwaves through Wall Street, the Dow dropping thousands of points, the S&P 500 losing several percentage points in a matter of days. Now consider the scale of the American stock market. Total U. FSET. Market capitalization is roughly $50 trillion. If markets drop 7% during a geopolitical shock, that's not just a bad week for investors. That's $3.5 trillion in lost wealth, retirement accounts, pension funds, 401k savings, the financial cushion millions of middle-class Americans depend on. But even that isn't the worst-case scenario, because the real danger comes from what happens next. Higher oil prices feed directly into inflation. And inflation, once it starts rising again, can trigger something economists fear more than almost anything else: stagflation, slowing economic growth, combined with rising prices. Gasoline prices moving toward $4 or even $5 per gallon. Food prices climbing again, heating costs rising across the country. And if inflation accelerates while the economy slows, the Federal Reserve faces a nightmare scenario because the usual tools stop working. Cut interest rates to help the economy. And inflation gets worse. Raise interest rates to fight inflation. And economic growth collapses. It's a trap. And according to several economists, this is exactly the kind of scenario that could push the U.S. descender economy toward a recession. But here's the shocking part. Even while those economic warnings were being discussed inside Washington, something else was happening behind closed doors. A battle inside the White House itself. Two completely different visions for how to deal with Iran. And the people pushing those visions could not have been more different, because on one side were the advisors arguing for diplomacy, and on the other side, a leader who believed the moment for war had finally arrived. Inside the White House, the argument over Iran had been building for weeks, and it wasn't a quiet disagreement. It was a real divide between two completely different strategies. On one side were the advisors who still believed diplomacy had a chance. Among them was Jared Kushner, who had been deeply involved in back-channel negotiations with Iranian representatives. According to multiple reports, Kushner had spent hours in Geneva trying to keep a possible nuclear agreement alive. His position was straightforward. Iran was weakened. Its economy was under pressure, and that meant a deal might still be possible. More importantly, Kushner believed the economic cost of war would far outweigh any strategic gains. Every week the negotiations continued was a week that avoided the risks of military escalation. But on the other side of the debate stood a very different voice. Benjamin Netanyahu. During his visit to Washington, the Israeli Prime Minister reportedly delivered a blunt argument to the White House. Iran had never been weaker. Its regional alliances were strained. Its economy was suffering under sanctions, and its leadership was increasingly isolated. In Netanyahu's view, this wasn't a moment for patience. It was a moment for pressure. According to reporting from multiple outlets, Netanyahu even arrived with a list of 73 targets connected to Iran's missile and military infrastructure. 73. The implication was clear. A decisive strike now could cripple Iran's military capabilities for years. So inside the White House, the choice became a clash between two competing visions: diplomacy or decisive force, negotiation or escalation. And as the days passed, Trump continued doing something his advisors had seen many times before. He kept changing his mind. One day he seemed convinced a deal was still possible. The next day he appeared ready to authorize military action. Advisors described the atmosphere as constant polling of opinions. Trump asking the same question repeatedly, testing the arguments, weighing the political risks, then changing direction again. It was the same pattern that had appeared in previous crises, the Iran strike debate the year before, the Venezuela operation in January, weeks of uncertainty, followed by a sudden final decision. And that's exactly what happened here. Because while the internal arguments continued, another clock was ticking in the background. The deadline Trump had publicly set: 10 days. 10 days for Iran to present a proposal that satisfied the White House. But the proposal never came. According to diplomatic sources, the negotiations in Geneva had made some progress, but Iran had not submitted a written agreement that met the specific conditions Trump had demanded. And without that document, the diplomatic option began collapsing. Then, intelligence reports delivered something that changed the timeline completely. A bid redown. Intelligence indicated that several senior Iranian leaders were gathered together at the same time, a rare moment when multiple high-value targets were in one place. And suddenly the debate inside the White House ended, because military decisions often turn on timing. You can wait weeks for negotiations. You can debate strategy for months. But if intelligence shows an opportunity that might disappear within hours, The pressure to act becomes overwhelming. According to officials, that moment triggered the final authorization. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt later explained that Trump believed Iran was already preparing potential attacks against American interests. In other words, the decision was framed not just as a strike, but as a preemptive move. And once the authorization was signed, the operation moved quickly. Airstrikes began. Multiple targets across Iran were hit, and within hours, reports began emerging about the scale of the damage. But then came the moment that shocked almost everyone watching. Because according to early claims from the administration, the strikes had killed dozens of members of Iran's leadership, including one name that immediately sent shockwaves through the geopolitical world: Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, the man who had ruled the country since 1989. If those reports were accurate, this wasn't just a military strike. It was the decapitation of an entire political system. And suddenly the question facing Washington was no longer about whether the attack succeeded. The question was, what comes next? Because removing the top leader of a country does not automatically create stability. Sometimes it creates something far more dangerous: a vacuum. And when power vacuums appear in volatile regions, history shows they rarely stay empty for long. Which brings us to the next problem. The one that has Republican strategists quietly panicking in Washington. Not the battlefield, the election map. If you want to understand why Republican strategists are nervous right now, you have to look at the numbers. Not the military numbers, the electoral numbers, because in Washington, every major decision eventually runs into one unavoidable reality: elections. Right now, Republicans control the House of Representatives with a narrow majority, 222 seats to 213. That's a 9-seat margin. On paper, that might sound comfortable. In reality, it's incredibly fragile, because history tells us something very clear about American politics. The party that controls the White House almost always loses seats in the first midterm election. Not a few seats. On average, about 30. 30. Now do the math. If Republicans lose 30 seats from a 9-seat majority, Democrats don't just take the House. They take it by a wide margin. That means a Democratic Speaker of the House, Trump's legislative agenda frozen overnight, and something even more dangerous politically: investigations, congressional hearings, subpoenas. 2 full years of political warfare inside Washington. But here's the part that really has Republican strategists worried. That 30-seat loss is the historical average. That's what normally happens. Without a war, without an oil shock, without an economic slowdown. Now imagine adding those factors into the equation. Imagine gasoline prices climbing toward $5 or even $6 per gallon. Imagine inflation suddenly returning just months before voters go to the polls. Imagine retirement accounts shrinking after a major market sell-off. In that environment, the political damage could be far worse than the historical average. Some internal political models reportedly show scenarios where Republicans could lose 50 seats in the House. 50. That wouldn't just flip control of Congress. It would create a Democratic majority large enough to dominate the next 2 years of Washington politics. But the House isn't the only battlefield. The Senate map might be even more dangerous. In the 2026 cycle, Republicans are defending 21 Senate seats. Democrats are defending only 13. That imbalance already makes the map difficult. Lose 3 Republican seats, and Democrats take control of the Senate. Lose 5. And they have a comfortable majority. Now combine that with rising gas prices and a major international conflict. Suddenly, a number of states that normally lean Republican start looking competitive. Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Arizona, Nevada, Maine, North Carolina. In each of those states, candidates could face the same question again and again during the campaign. Why did your party start this war? That's the nightmare scenario Republican strategists are quietly discussing, because wars don't just play out on battlefields. They play out at the gas pump, at the grocery store, in retirement accounts, and ultimately in voting booths. One Republican strategist summed up the situation with brutal honesty in a recent interview. "No one thinks this war is popular. At best," he said, "it's a distraction from the issue voters care about most, the economy, and that's exactly what makes this moment so politically dangerous." Just days before the strikes began, Trump had delivered a State of the Union-style message focused almost entirely on affordability, lower prices, stronger growth, economic stability. That was supposed to be the central argument heading into the midterms. The winning message, but within days, the national conversation shifted from inflation to war, from grocery prices to missile strikes, from economic recovery to geopolitical crisis. The strategy that had taken months to build disappeared almost overnight. And now, Republican candidates across the country may find themselves campaigning in a completely different political environment, one dominated by uncertainty, because at this point, the future of this conflict really comes down to just two possible paths. One leads to a quick resolution. The other leads to a spiral that could reshape global politics and the American economy for years. And right now, nobody in Washington can say for sure which path we're heading toward. So where does this go from here? Right now, analysts see two possible paths, two very different futures. And the difference between them could decide not only the outcome of this conflict, but the political future of Washington itself. Let's start with the optimistic scenario. In this version, the Iranian leadership is thrown into chaos after the strikes. The power structure fractures. Different factions inside the Revolutionary Guard compete with each other rather than organizing a unified retaliation. Without a clear central command, Iran's ability to project power weakens. The Strait of Hormuz gradually reopens. Oil tankers begin moving again. Energy markets calm down. Oil prices drift back toward the mid-$80 range. The stock market stabilizes. Inflation pressures remain higher than before the conflict, but they stay manageable. In that scenario, Trump declares victory. The administration argues that the strikes successfully crippled Iran's military leadership and prevented future threats. Republicans pivot quickly back to their economic message. Yes, the war caused disruption. Yes, the midterms become more difficult, but the political damage is limited. Instead of losing 30 seats, Republicans might lose 15 or 20 in the House. Painful, but survivable. And the Senate could remain narrowly in Republican hands. In that outcome, Trump's presidency emerges bruised, but still intact. But that optimistic scenario depends on several things happening very quickly. Iran's leadership would need to collapse faster than it reorganizes. Regional proxies like Hezbollah, the Houthis, and militia groups in Iraq would need to avoid major escalation. And perhaps most importantly, the Strait of Hormuz would need to remain open. All of that would need to happen within weeks before the summer energy demand surge pushes oil prices even higher. Is that possible? Yes. But many economists and geopolitical analysts are deeply skeptical, because the second path looks very different. In the second scenario, Iran doesn't collapse. It fragments. Different factions of the Revolutionary Guard spread across the region and begin responding asymmetrically. Instead of traditional military battles, they target economic pressure points, energy infrastructure, shipping lanes, regional allies. Not necessarily to win the war militarily, but to make the conflict economically unbearable. Oil prices stay above $100 per barrel through the summer. Inflation rises again. The Federal Reserve faces enormous pressure to keep interest rates high or even raise them further. Economic growth slows dramatically. By the third quarter, the United States enters what economists call stagflation. Slow growth combined with rising prices. Gasoline reaches $5 a gallon and stays there heading into the fall. And by the time voters head to the polls in November, The political question dominating every debate becomes painfully simple. Why did this war start? In that environment, the political damage for Republicans could be massive. The House flips, the Senate flips, and the final 2 years of Trump's presidency become defined by investigations, congressional battles, and legislative paralysis. For some historians, the comparison that immediately comes to mind is impossible to ignore. Iraq. In 2003, President George W. Bush launched the Iraq War with strong public support. His approval rating soared above 70%. For a moment, it looked like Republicans were politically unstoppable. But the war dragged on longer than expected. The costs grew larger. Public support faded. And by the 2006 midterms, Iraq had become a political millstone around the neck of every Republican candidate in the country. Republicans lost 30 seats in the House, 6 seats in the Senate, and control of both chambers of Congress. But here's the key difference. The Iraq War did not trigger a global oil crisis. It did not send inflation surging. And it did not crash financial markets. The political damage came mostly from the war's duration and the perception of failure. A conflict with Iran carries all of those risks plus the economic shock, which is why some analysts believe the stakes of this moment are even higher. Right now, we are only days into the conflict. American service members have already been killed. Iranian retaliatory strikes are expanding across the region. Oil markets remain volatile. And inside Washington, one question hangs over everything. Did the United States just eliminate a long-term threat or ignite a conflict that could reshape global politics and the American economy for years? The answer depends entirely on what happens next. Because wars always look simple at the beginning. They almost never stay that way. And history has shown something again and again. Every president who believes a war will be quick eventually has to explain why it wasn't. For now, the strikes have already happened, the forces are already deployed, and the consequences are already unfolding. The only question left is how far they go.